For tonight's performance of Wicked, the part of Elphaba will be... Good evening. It's really good to have you here. We have had a wonderful journey together. This series was inspired by an article in the Atlantic Monthly that occurred, I think, last year in April by the journalist Franklin Foer called, "Is the American Jewish Century Coming to an End?" It was a very provocative article cataloging the changes that have come over American Jewish life since October 7th. And the article inspired me to think about this for the high holidays and then call one of my dearest friends, Professor Stephen Windmuller, who I believe is the greatest scholar of American Jewish life that I know in the world, because he is deeply in love and passionate about the Jewish people, but when he writes, his scholarship is so careful and so rational. It's almost un-Jewish how careful you are. Because usually people get upset and they get involved in their ideologies and wishful thinking creeps in, and Stephen is one of the few scholars who actually thinks carefully and deeply and honestly about where we are, and that makes him incredibly valuable to our community. So before we even start tonight, I want to express my thanks to Stephen for sharing this with us. Wonderful, wonderful learning together. And for all of your information, so after tonight's session, the entire series, all 5 lectures, will be put up online on the VBS YouTube channel, and you can watch the whole thing again and again and again. There's no commercials. You can enjoy it. So welcome. Tonight is Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies, where, as our motto says, we offer university-level Jewish learning without quizzes, no sororities, and no football teams. We're delighted to have you here. A very special welcome to Lil and Jess Beim, whose generosity makes all this possible. Thank you both, and to your family. It's an honor to have you with us tonight. And to everyone who's joined us, a very special thank you again, so I don't forget later, because I will, to Alana Zimmerman, who is running around someplace, for making all of this possible and sharing, this wonderful opportunity for learning. Tonight, we have spent the last 4 sessions really looking at the past, at the history of the American Jewish century. Last week, at the threats that have come upon the community since October 7th. And tonight, we'd like to look at the present and a little bit into the future about what might be coming with some very, very dear friends. But first, we do this as a community of friends. So if everyone will stand up, as we do here, turn around and say hello to the folks on the other side. Yeah, this is a Jewish community event. The parents of all of our panelists are here tonight. Right. All right, don't sit down. You're going to be sitting a long time. Come close. Get smush up close next to the people you're with. We say 2 blessings in gratitude for the opportunity to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav vetzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. So when Stephen and I planned this series, we decided that the 2 of us could handle the conversations about history. We invited some guests. A couple of weeks ago, we had Professor Ron Wolfson and Professor Joshua Hollow to talk about the academic and educational implications of this century. But when it came to talking about what's coming, we recognized that both of us are deeply rooted and completely comfortable in the 20th century. Professor Windmuller in the 20th century CE and me in the 20th century BCE. But we are 20th century scholars. We needed 21st century leaders. And so we reached into the community to three very, very dear friends who are willing to come tonight and to share with us from their perspective as 21st century Jewish leaders and activists and visionaries where we are as a community and where we're going. To introduce our panel, Professor Windmuller.
So it's so wonderful to have our three guests with us. Sorry.
Is that working?
It's
working. Scream.
Screaming.
Here, try this one, sir.
Can you hear me now? No, thank you. So it's wonderful to have our three guests with us. So our colleagues, Rabbi Mari Chernow is the senior rabbi at Temple Israel of Hollywood. And before coming to this historic congregation, Mari was, since her ordination in 2003, had been in Temple Chai in Phoenix. And in 2009, she was named to its senior position. She's a graduate of the University of San Diego and HUC, where she was ordained in 2003. She's an extraordinary writer, thinker, and has a particular interest in philosophy. Joanna Mendelson is a graduate of Emory University, and she did a dual major, which is kind of fascinating. Intersectionality studies and Spanish. But graduating from Emory, which she did in the year 2000, she proceeded to work for the ADL in a number of very significant roles, both through its center on the study of hate and a variety of other functions within this important agency. And more recently, she has come to the Jewish Federation as Vice President for Community Engagement, where she's leading a major department in the involvement of the Federation and our Jewish community in the public square. Matt Barham is the Executive Director of Hillel 818, and I'm a board member, so I work for Matt. Matt was, for 8 years prior to his appointment at Hillel, a key staff person at Sinai Temple, where he was director of the millennial community, and was an extraordinary resource in terms of all of their activities in that arena. He's a graduate of Boston University in the field of communications, and he has grown up in a small Jewish community outside of Hartford. And in that community, Matt was really the typical United Synagogue conservative Jewish background. He was active at Ramah, at USY, and he was deeply involved in his synagogue community. And he has an extraordinary grandfather who has passed away, but his grandfather was really a key figure in American Jewish affairs in the field of public policy and was a distinguished judge and attorney. So welcome all of you to our program tonight. So we're going to start from each of your perspectives. What do you currently see as the sort of key features of the American Jewish experience? What sort of stands out for you as a rabbi, as a communal professional, and as a Hillel professional? Rabbi Chernow, you would like to begin?
Sure, be happy to start. Thank you so much. What an honor and pleasure it is to be here. Nice to be with these wonderful panelists. So I'll just name a couple of things. On the good news front, there is a very deep interest in affiliating as a Jew. From my perspective, to name just one example of it, of course, it has been partly inspired by an incredibly horrific moment, which was October 7th of last year. But there's a very deep longing to come inside and identify and feel connected and be a part of the community. We have a day school like VBS. We have a day school at Temple Israel of Hollywood. And within a month of following October 7th, 4 different non-Jewish parents of day school students walked into my office and said, I've been thinking about converting for 20 years. I know it's time to do it right now. And not one of them had a bit of hesitation about the anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. They felt like it was a reason to come inside. And I've only now just begun seeing those conversions through to the end, and they're just really, really, really beautiful and really, really powerful. So it is redemptive, maybe in a way, to see people deeply connected to their Jewish identity. Having said that, something that Dr. Windmuller has written about and talked about in many places is that identifying Jewishly means something very, very different than probably it did for any of us growing up and for any of us in our own educations. And I think that my take on it, I don't know if this is reflects the country, but my take on it is that we need to target our Jewish experience and engagement toward making life better. We need to address the human condition, and it needs to be about making people feel less lonely and have richer experiences to reflect on and deeper ways to think about their lives and feel joy in their lives. Judaism, I happen to believe, is an extraordinary way to do that, but in order to be convincing and compelling to people, we need to make their lives better. That's what we need to be busy doing. And the third thing I'll say is that the polarization that we see out there is in here. And I would say that's the thing that I am most worried about, is a potential very deep rift in the Jewish community over politics, both here in America and in Israel.
I would actually break it down into two time frames, right? What is the element that defines the Jewish experience? And I would say if you looked at pre-October 7th, we had one perspective. Federation issued a report, we hadn't done it in 30 years, the study of Jewish Los Angeles. And I know that Rabbi Feinstein has taken it and kind of studied it and worked in discussions on how do we apply this knowledge from this data set. But what we found is that people have a yearning to belong. Perhaps it's not centralized around synagogue engagement, but there's other ways that people connect to their Judaism. Through service. And I can tell you that when we have service programs at the Federation, we've increased the service engagement by 187% from one year to the next. We are sold out every single time we offer programming, people who want to volunteer and do Tikkun Olam. So the expression of Judaism really manifests in different ways. It's not necessarily a traditional way in which you see kind of Jewish identity. It's maybe in social service, maybe in culture, maybe in reading books, maybe in socializing or being part of communities. So it kind of has transformed over time, and not in a more traditional way that we may have looked at Judaism. But I would say October 7th was a defining moment in how the Jewish community responded. Right? This is perhaps one of the darkest moments that many of us have experienced. The most Jews killed since the Holocaust. And so I would say that was a moment where, if you look at the Jewish community, talk about the mobilization. $850 million was raised by our country in a very short period of time. And if you look at it here in Los Angeles, we raised $38 million from our Los Angeles Jewish community. So the expression of love and support of Israel, regardless of the complication and what we witnessed in terms of the democratic fission within Israel that I witnessed when I went to visit Israel and the protests in the street, suddenly you saw the Jewish community just coming together and responding with support. And if you can kind of break that down in terms of the ways we show up, on October 7th we organized an event at Saban Theater. It was filled within 2 days. We had 2,600 people in the room and 10,000 people who logged in online. The community is really searching to come together and to be together. I would also say the understanding of the Jewish community and the multitude of the Jewish community is something that has to be also articulated. So if we think about it in an Ashkenazi normative way, and we're focused on kind of the Eastern Europe manifestations of Judaism, we're missing out on this entire community here in Los Angeles, where we have the largest Iranian population outside of Iran. We have the second largest Israeli community outside of Israel. We have a huge Russian community. And the fastest growing community is Jews of color. So either through adoption or through families that intermarriage and so forth who are raising Jewish children, we see a very fast rising rate of kind of a very diverse community. So these are all elements at play that are defining this Jewish moment.
Thank you all so much for having me. I also just want to let you know, since we're speaking in front of a VBS crowd, that my wife Elena is one of the second grade teachers here at VBS Day School.
Right.
That's all I should mention. Look, I think that one of the distinguishing things about the American Jewish community, you heard both Rabbi Chernow and Joanna use the phrase Jewish identity multiple times. And I think that this conversation about Jewish identity in of itself is often pretty unique to the American Jewish community. And what is so unique about it is that it's so individualistic, that every single Jew has a very diverse and unique individualized journey in order to forge their Jewish identity. And when we talk about Jewish community, one of the things that keeps coming up for me is how many Jews don't necessarily feel part of that greater community. When I started at Hillel, and as Dr. Windmuller said, I come from like a very traditional Jewish bubble. I went to Jewish day school, I went to Jewish summer camp, I was involved in USY, I chose my college based on what the Jewish population was like. I was in a Jewish rock band while I was in college. When I started at Hillel 818, we were tabling on campus, and I met a Jewish student, and I said, "Have you ever been on Birthright?" In all my years in the Jewish community, I had met students who didn't want to go on Birthright because they thought it was too political, or they were worried that Israel wasn't going to be safe, or they didn't want to spend their spring break on an organized trip. This student looked at me and said, "What's Birthright?" And it was just this big moment for me of remembering that I've been in this bubble, and there are so many Jews who are not part of that bubble, who don't feel they're part of the community, who have never had an active or good engagement with the organized Jewish world. And when we talk about the uniqueness of the American Jewish community, I think it's important to understand that we are not monolith, and what we consider to be the norms, those of us who are part of synagogues like VBS, there are so many Jews who have no idea, who don't understand the language that we use. What I will say is I do think that since October 7th, what I have seen college students at least, is whether they come from the most secular background or the most traditional, there is this desire to intentionally explore that Jewish identity in a more meaningful way. And I think that is a beautiful opportunity that has come out of such tragedy, and it's on all of us to figure out how to take advantage of that and use it to build a better Jewish.
So, taking off from where Matt left off about this individualistic Jewish identity, and following through with what Malcolm Four's article reflected about the vast changes happening, what do you see as the Jewish future? What are some of the possibilities here in light of the changes you've each described and that now confront us?
So I think I don't think we know what the institutions will look like, and I think they will probably change. But the only thing I can tell you is that I feel confident and optimistic that people are going to need meaning in their lives, and Jewish texts and tradition are an invaluable source of meaning. I can't, before October 7th especially, everybody was talking all the time about, is it the end of the era of the large suburban synagogue? And we've put that aside because we're worried about other things right now. And honestly, I feel like, I don't know, but we're here right now and we're doing Jewish stuff right now, and there's a power to it that's like is it going to be a terrible, terrible thing if we don't have synagogues like this with multiple rabbis? Or is it, it will be sad in certain ways, but I guess I just have to say that I'm confident that Judaism has so much to offer the human condition that the essence of it isn't going anywhere.
I would say one core element, and not from a kind of a synagogue point, but how we approach Judaism in this current moment, right? We're working we're in the kind of the shadow of October 7th. The Holocaust is not far behind. But how do we really incorporate Jewish joy in how we approach our Judaism? And I think that is, and you're talking about someone who worked in domestic terrorism for 22 years, so our family discussions were about who hates the Jews, right? And the heaviness and the anti-Semitism that's all around it. But I think that if we're thinking about Judaism in this next chapter, I think we have to kind of remind ourselves about the Jewish joy. What are the elements in which we can have our kids not focus on all the tragedy and the trauma, but figure out what is it about Judaism that gives us joy? What is the celebratory elements of our Judaism? How do we show up in the world? And so I think that's kind of shifting our mindset, because we have to give not that kind of guilt-laden Judaism, but a Judaism that can inspire and that can kind of enhance life. I think the other thing is that not viewing Judaism as kind of the existential threat of our future, right, and the kind of a fear and focus internally, but how do we build allyship, and how do we really develop how we show up in our community? And I can tell you, in this moment, we hear a lot of pushback, like how can we invest in those outside, right? Those who, if it's a progressive movements or so forth, where have they been? And this is exactly the moment, I believe, that for us to be successful as Jews, we have to engage, as Rabbi Chernoff just said. How do we do good, and how do we affect change? How do we do social justice? How do we address the issues of our community? Because until we can create that allyship, we will be alone, and we can't do this alone. And I will tell you just before a little tiny example. This last year, we brought up the largest delegation to lobby with us in Sacramento at JPAC, Jewish Public Affairs Committee. We brought 100 people from Los Angeles to rally and to advocate and to lobby on issues that impact the Jewish community. And for the first time ever, it wasn't just Jews who we brought up. We partnered with members of the Black community, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ. And together, they lobbied with us on issues that we all could stand shoulder to shoulder with. And so that is how we need to approach how we, kind of the future of our Judaism.
This is such a complicated question because there's so many different aspects to Judaism, right? Are we talking about the future of the Jewish culture, of the Jewish religion, of peoplehood? Each of those areas we could then, dissect in numerous other layers. What I will say is that I think the good news, or bad news, is that I think people are in search of more than, I'm fairly young, I'm 38, but in my lifetime, it seems like the search for meaning is as strong, if not stronger, than ever. And people are really looking for something to inspire them, for way we brand and the way we message and the way we talk about the need and the beauty of what we do have to be more intense. It means that the things that we know don't work, but we've always done because they were easy and they were comfortable, we can't just do them anymore. Because, for example, there are very few young Jews. I'm a little bit hyperbolic, but there are not a large amount of Jews my age or younger who will ever join a synagogue because of high holidays or because of Shabbat morning service. They're looking for social groups, they're looking for meaningful programs, meaningful relationships, a feeling of home, but it's not going to be about service, right? We could go through every type of Jewish organization and have a similar conversation. And so for the future, we're not going away. I actually am very hopeful for the future. But I do think that the way that we talk about what we do and message what we do and the type and where we put our focus and the professionalism with which we do things has to continue to improve.
So it's interesting that the word Israel, while important certainly for October 7th and certainly in terms of the ways in which we've responded, but where does Israel fit in the longer-term projection of what we define as the Jewish future? And part of that is certainly diaspora Jewry more generally, the global roles that we've played. So for an audience that has really grown up with Israel and has seen Israel as an essential ingredient in their lives and even in their identity, for us, for them, this is a powerful piece. Where does it sit for the future?
The main thing that I want to say about this is that we Jews have to learn how to talk to each other. We can't have, we're stuck avoiding the conversations that we need to have about Israel and what it could mean and what it might mean and what it used to mean. And when I talked earlier about polarization, I really am very seriously worried about I think there's massive polarization going on in Israel and in America and in America about Israel. And I think that I'm a little bit on fire about this right now, and I don't want to overstate our importance, but I think that if we can learn to have real conversations in a room like this, it can be done on Capitol Hill. So let's start in our small institutions, learning how to talk to each other and listen to each other, and see if we can spread that around a little bit.
Wow. I would say many of you may have experienced Israel as a scrappy nation, right? As a nation that came out of that, marshlands and mosquitoes and desert, right? And yet my 3 daughters only know Israel as this really strong, incredible power, right? So it changes the entire way in which we looked at this whole David Goliath concept, and the kind of the way in which young kids are approaching Israel, and some of the questions in my home and many, many other homes. Is a different conversation. It's a different way of viewing. I will say an overwhelming majority, though, sees Israel as a deep part of their identity. And so I think the challenge and the visceral reaction that we get in these conversations can be so polarizing because it feels very deeply personal. When your identity is denied on campus, or when our people are calling for the dissolution for the state of Israel, that is an attack of one's identity, right? That is the belief in the existence. And so you're talking about the gestalt of how we approach Israel. And I think that's very challenging. And we're also dealing in a milieu where if you look at TikTok and you look at the algorithms and you look at some of these, there's systemic elements on our social media that are elevating certain narratives over other narratives. It it's overwhelming, right? It's definitely something that we are kind of pushing up a hill, but it is really kind of overcoming us. And just another, another layer to our conversation of how we talk about differences and dialogue. How do we also keep the temperatures down too, right? How do we, and right, it's a very challenging thing when we have heads of schools and superintendents and the parents come in armed and angry and ready for a fight. How can they be more productive, more successful, and then what fights do we take on, right? Right now, you may have seen there's a Van Nuys library that has a Palestinian, it's circulating all over the internet today, right? People are, surveys and everything going out. We have to look into it. But there's a library that's having, in Van Nuys, that's having a display of a week of Palestinian, read about the Palestinian community. And before we get up in arms, right, let's learn a little bit about the approach and understand immediately it's calling for the firing of the librarian and thousands of letters and so forth. So I think we just have to figure out, how do we maintain the upper hand? How do we lower the temperature? How do we figure out which fights we have to pick? But also mobilize together as a community so we are effective, because Israel matters to the overwhelming majority of Jews.
It's a big, these are all, tiny, small questions we're dealing with tonight. Look, I have two things. One is that I'm actually pretty optimistic about how Israel plays into the future, at least amongst Jews. I think that anti-Zionist Jewish community is very loud but smaller than, and they're very loud, they make a lot of noise, but I think it's a much smaller number than we worry exists. And I think if you ask Hillel directors around the country, who are usually on the forefront of dealing with the anti-Semitic Jewish crowd on campus, they would agree with that. So I'm pretty optimistic. To do a 10 seconds of Torah, this week's Torah portion, this was actually taught to me by Rabbi Nolan back when he was an intern at Sinai about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer. There's the famous scene of Jacob having the dream of angels going up and down the ladder. And the words in the Torah are Olim ve'yordim, up and down. And Rashi looks at this and says, well, the angels, like the reason it says Olim then Yordim is because angels had accompanied Jacob on his journey, and they needed to go back up before there was room for new angels to come back down. And there's this whole spiritual, magical explanation. And Rashi's grandson, 2 generations later, the Rashban, comments on this same verse and says, no, there was no mystical anything. It's just the way we talk, like peanut butter and jelly, Olim ve'yordim. It's just grammatically, it was how people spoke. And the idea here is that oftentimes what's really magical in one generation, a couple generations later, is really hard to still look at it with the same level of magic. And we know that's been true with Israel, right? From my grandparents' generation, Israel was this modern miracle that they couldn't believe truly existed. Versus for our students now, they've always known Israel. It's this strong power. It has one of the best economies in the world. Incredible scientific innovation, medical innovation. It's one of the greatest countries in the world, and that's all they've ever known. And what we've done as a Jewish community, to, I think, the detriment of the Israel conversation, is we want to recapture the magic so much that we only tell them the positive things about Israel. We only teach them the pro-Israel narrative. And what happens is, and this is not new, this has been talked about in Jewish education for a while now, is that eventually they go to college and they get exposed to the other narrative, and they feel like we've been lying to them for years and years. So, in my opinion, in order to have a Jewish future where Israel continues to be a meaningful component for the next generation of Jews, we have to, at the very least, not just be able to talk with people that agree with us, but really understand anti-Israel narratives, not agree, but understand them and be able to explain to our students and the next generation of Jews why people believe the things they do, and explain to them this is their perspective, and do it in a real, meaningful, educated way. Only when we explain the totality of opinions and narratives can you really have a conversation with someone you disagree with. Because when they see that you appreciate what they're saying, even if you have strong disagreement, and they see that you've taken the time to understand their perspective, that's how you can build consensus. So I think, and we've made major strides, by the way, in the last 10 years in particular, in how we do Israel education and doing a multi-narrative approach. And for those of you who worry when I say that, it creates much stronger Israel advocates because they have a much stronger foundation to stand on. But there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Okay. So all three of you represent institutions that are being challenged at this moment. The synagogue world is being challenged as not reaching younger Jews, the rise of the religious nuns, the sense that synagogues are, as Matt framed it, using a language that others simply don't even understand or respond to. In the case of federation, there is the argument that federations are out of touch with a community that is much more diverse, much more individualistic in the ways by which people choose philanthropic choices and connections. And to Hillel, the argument that yes, you're reaching a core of students, but there are literally thousands of other students we're not touching. And how do we deal with our critics, but also deal with some of the realities of what they're telling us about our current state of Jewish life?
Sure, I'll go first. Happy. Well, I think there's not one size, right? Not one size fits all. And I think that we have to appreciate what every entity, organization, big box or more kind of startup can bring to the table. I will tell you, we convened, I started Federation after 22 years at ADL, and Rabbi Noah and I came together and said, how do we address what's happening in terms of anti-Semitism? Because we each have a different way, we each have a core competency in terms of all these different organizations and what they can bring to the table. How do we harness that? Because this problem is too big for any one of us. There's not one single solution. So we formed an anti-Semitism roundtable that meets, I would say we're on WhatsApp daily in terms of incidents, things that are happening. But we all understand that we each have relationships. We all understand our strengths. We all play roles. Some good cop, some bad cop, right? Some can relate to this group of students and that group of students. Some is more active on campus. Some have better relationships with elected officials. And we work together and we collaborate because we have to solve this problem together. So I would say that applies not only just with the anti-Semitism roundtable, but also how we approach Judaism and how we, if it's not one table or Moishe House or Hillel or Chabad, or there are so many avenues and entry points in, and we have to just continue to invest in them because, again, not on the continuum, not everyone identifies with religiosity. They identify with matzo ball soup, right? Like there are different ways in which we can bring our community and our Jewish community in together. Did that give you enough time? No.
I think that there's two types of critics in the Hillel world. There's the student critic and then everybody else. The student critic is much easier because if a student comes to us and says, we don't like the way Hillel does thing X, or we wish you were doing thing Y, then the response is, great, we would love for you to come help us change. Right? That's a really, in fact, the hardest part is when there's a student who has a challenge with Hillel
It's great. I'll comment on that in a second. But first, I'll just say, at VBS, you guys have critics? At TIOH, we haven't had any critics, I think, in my time. Oh, just kidding. They're everywhere. Yeah, right. No, sorry. So I think that, Matt, your point is, thank you for giving me the language for something I wanted to say, which is that one of the solutions is relational. We have to sit down with people and be open to them, and maybe sometimes we surprise them with our openness and what we have to say and what we have to offer. And the other thing I'll say, which is a variation on that, is that I believe that every human being has a spiritual life. And if they're getting it from us in some way, wonderful. And if they're not, if they're getting it from somewhere else, A, maybe that's okay. And B, maybe there's something that we need to learn from that. So if people are getting their spiritual lives fulfilled in yoga, first of all, I don't think it helps us to sort of scorn that and shame people about that. And second of all, maybe we need to learn something about how people need to move their bodies when they're thinking about their spiritual lives. Maybe that's why Rabbi Feinstein wanted us to stand up. And so I think that that we could be, I'm guilty of this all the time, but we could be a little bit less threatened by what people are doing out there, and instead be open to how Judaism can grow in the ways that we're learning from people.
One of the ways that a community fails is the failure of imagination. No? I think we killed it. One of the ways that a community fails is when its imagination fails. And the status quo defines the horizon beyond which it can plan and think and envision. I want to give you a magic wand for a moment. We asked you before to be prophets. Now I want you to be wizards. I want to know what you'd like to have, what you'd like to see, what you'd like to change. When you envision this community 20 years, 10 years hence, 10 years from now, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. We don't know what's going to happen in Washington. We don't know what's going to happen in this community. But we do know that we control the community. We control the life of the internal life of the community. What would you like to see happen? What future would you like to envision and to offer us a way to go forward?
So I guess I want to say that the first thing that came to mind is I want Jewish organizations that fill us with awe. That, to me, that is such a profound building block of a Jewish life and a spiritual life. And we are all city folk, and so I actually think that the Shabbat we need is, forgive me, but a little bit less being in a room like this, and a little bit more being on a mountain and being at a lakeside. And I think that's the Shabbat that we need. I think in a world where people worked outside, they needed to come in. They needed Shabbat to come and think and talk. We do a lot of that, so I think we need. So if I'm gonna really imagine, that's Shabbat, number one, awe, and number two, it's gonna sound so cheesy, but I think we need to fill our lives with more love. I think that's what the Jewish people should be doing, pouring more love into the world, pouring more love into each other, pouring more love into our own hearts, and I'd like to be a vehicle for doing that.
Sure. I think there's a few things I would like to see. Number one is the cost of Jewish life has to come down. It is expensive in many, not just in terms of money, in terms of the effort that it takes to be part of the organized Jewish world, but also literally the money is a barrier for a lot more Jews than we often realize, and it's only getting more expensive. And along with that, what you said about the love and the awe is so true. And in order to do that in 2024 and beyond, we need better professionals and more Jewish professionals than we've ever needed. Because, as I said before, there isn't that sense of obligation that helps recruit Jews to be part of these organizations. Instead, it's because we are offering this incredibly high-level experience. And to do that, for the amount of programs that VBS offers now versus 30 years ago, I'm guessing the staff here is at least double the size of what it used to be. No comment. No. You still look great, Rabbi. But it takes a army of Jewish professionals, and while we take that a lot more seriously than we did when I was a kid. I often tell the story of my dad was on the board of Yukon Hillel, and he came back from a meeting. I was like 12 or 13, and he said, you would make a great Hillel director one day. Too bad it doesn't pay a real job salary. And that was how people talked about Jewish professionals when I was a kid, and he didn't mean that maliciously. That was just how it was thought about. And the difficulty of attracting top-level talent and keeping top-level talent is so immense, and so often it's because we put too much responsibility and not enough dollars, and like there's this saying inside the Jewish professional world that the easiest way to create a Jewish anti-Semite is to give them a Jewish job, and it's said in jest, and it's a dark joke, obviously, but it's because it is really hard work that the community, again, I think supports so much more than we used to, but we still have a long way to go. And if we expect these people to be able to create the experience that allow us to experience that awe and the joy and the magic of Judaism, we have to make sure that they are supported. You can tell I'm a Hillel director when I say this, because keeping talent is always at the top of mind of everything I do.
I love it. This is hard. Oh, so I would say, gosh, I really have a magic wand? Like really magic wand. Okay, all right, here we go. So I'd like us to come out of this moment right now with October 7th without a hardened heart, right? I feel like in some ways we're farther away from potential for peace, and I'm afraid of the impact on our community. So I hope that we can come out of this with still hope, with still a desire, like the whole Abraham Accords and the wave that we were riding before, and the hope we have for Middle East, and for that peace, that is something we can still hold on to, because I can tell you right now it feels very, very heavy and existential. I would agree in terms of the price point of Judaism. If there is some magic wand that we can have to make it more accessible, it's expensive to really fully engage with the Jewish community in this moment in every which way. I would hope that we have a broader base of allies that look at Judaism and look at how an understanding of who we are. The fact that we brought 120 superintendents together, and one of the men said to me, I had no idea there were Ethiopian Jews, that you have black Jews. How is an African-American man educated and involved but had no idea about our community? So my magic wand would be a deeper understanding with how we show up and how others perceive us. And that could be many entry points for Jews, and people would feel very proud of their Judaism, however they found their way in, and that it would all be supported and embraced. So that's my wand.
So I think we sometimes overlook events and situations beyond our community. The 2008 economic recession, the 2020 pandemic are two such events that really changed us. They changed our institutions in 2008, and they changed our lifestyles and our thinking about life in 2020. So I think we need to understand how events impact how we live and the ways in which we might dream about the future. The other reality is that there's something happening in the Jewish community that has such exciting and profound possibilities. The kinds of endowed foundational giving that we have seen emerge in the 21st century and in the latter half of the 20th century has really reshaped what philanthropy is about and what it can mean in terms of the kinds of resources that the Jewish community can envision. So that there are hundreds, as we talked about in one of our last sessions, hundreds of new expressions of Jewish life and living. Our colleagues here on the panel mentioned several of them in connection with different activities associated with seeing the present state of our community. But one of those activities, for example, is resetting the table. It's all about conversations and creating the framework for how Jews talk to one another and how groups talk to each other. And there are other such extraordinary experiments and developments in this whole arena of alternative ways by which one can dialogue, deal with climate change, look at issues of Jewish spirituality, methods of study, questions related to Israel, alternatives to philanthropic giving. So it's a really explosion in terms of Jewish possibilities. And I think what's exciting about that is that it gives us all, as our colleagues have suggested, all these many points of entry, which is something we forget, that it's not simply the legacy institutions that are reaching and touching Jews. It is all of these extraordinary new opportunities. The missing links here are really that we haven't understood the impact of social media. Social media is really reframing a whole generation in terms of how it gets its news and how it understands community, how it understands Jews, how it looks at Israel. We've got to figure out a way in which we can compete and participate more effectively in that market square. And the other has to do with the fact that we are beginning to see the extraordinary development of the rise of the National Jewish Synagogue, which I also spoke about. The ability of a synagogue such as Central Synagogue in New York or Park Avenue in New York to be able to reach literally hundreds of thousands of people. And how do we turn that into something that isn't challenging or threatening to Temple Israel of Hollywood or to Valley Beshalom, but as something that is a partner with them in actually growing the Jewish learning engagement experience? Matt mentioned the notion to us that there are some Jews who simply don't know the language of the synagogue. And we now have some studies that tell us that 37% of American Jews who are not synagogue members will tell you that one of the reasons they won't walk into these halls is that they're scared that Rabbi Feinstein may call upon them to do something with liturgy or Hebrew or a text, and they don't understand the language. They're not comfortable with that whole framework, and therefore they step away. And there's another study that talked specifically that the American Jewish Committee produced for us on the cost of Jewish living. And it's an extraordinary study which tells us that if you really want to live a full and enriching life, you need to be able to expend between $50,000 and $100,000 a year just on being Jewish, in terms of kashrut, Israel travel, belonging to institutions, sending your children to schools, to day schools, participating in all the kinds of Jewish offerings and possibilities that exist. So these then become both the possibilities but also the challenges. So we have to figure out a way of bringing down some of those barriers and just really exploring the possibilities associated with all the changes happening around us that allow us sort of to enter into that world and bring others into that experience of really seeing Judaism as this extraordinary capacity of choice, opportunity, and learning.
That's great. I'll give two, and then I'll give a closing thing before we entertain questions. If I had my magic wand and I really had unlimited power, I think that we should redefine birthright from a trip to Israel when you're 20 to a quality Jewish education for every Jewish child from infancy through high school. And if the parents can't afford it, we give it to them for free. And we'll need the financial and the social infrastructure in order to do that. The financial, because it's going to be expensive, and the social infrastructure to train teachers, create curriculum, engage in programs that engage those families, and that becomes the goal of the community. If we can't afford that, which I imagine that's kind of awfully imaginary, then if I had a smaller goal along the same lines, for me, the most formative Jewish experience was summer camp. And the idea that every Jewish child should have a place in a Jewish summer camp, a day camp when they're little, and an overnight camp when they get older, and a grown-up camp as they get older than that, and that every summer that kid is immersed in a Jewish place, speaking Hebrew, and engaged in Jewish life of whatever kind, whether it's communal or religious or socialist or Zionist, of whatever kind, but an engaging, immersive experience over the summertime. And that the community provides that as a birthright. That is, we don't charge for that, or if the families can afford it, whatever they can afford, make sure it's possible. That, I think, is a goal that's reachable, and I think it's a goal that would have a decisive effect on the Jewish future. The second thing I'll say is also controversial and crazy. I think that there's a fundamental contradiction in American Zionism that's become painfully obvious this last year, and that is that we here in America look at Israel, but Israel for us is largely a symbol. It's a symbol of Jewish life, Jewish persistence, Jewish heart. In Israel, it's a reality, and Israelis live different Jewish lives than we do, and those lives there's a huge gap between them. And you can see that when they come here and we go there. When Israeli families come to America, this is bewildering to them. I mean, even now, Israeli families will come and they'll visit here for a bar mitzvah or a wedding, and they'll say to me, I speak decent Hebrew, bad, but decent, you know. They'll say, I never saw anything like this. What is this? What is this place? They have no idea how we conduct Jewish life here. And when we go to Israel, you know, if you get out of the bus and you're not wearing white shoes and polyester pants with a camera around your neck, but you really engage with Israeli life, you discover just how different it is than what you thought it might be. Now, once upon a time, these two societies were geographically far apart. They're not anymore. Today, you could go to LAX tonight and get on a flight. It leaves at 1 in the afternoon. And be in Israel 1 o'clock the next day. It leaves every single day. It's El Al 5 there and El Al 6 back. Costs you a lot of money, but that's because El Al's got no competition today. But it's easy to get there. And I think the idea of exchanging, of not advocating aliyah, because that's a huge, crazy commitment. But every Jewish family should go live in Israel for a month. Put their kids in an Israeli kindergarten to learn how to speak Hebrew. All of our professionals should participate in professional life in Israel, and Israelis should come here and participate in our lives, and we should exchange homes and exchange lives for time so that we can share each other's lived experience, and that American Zionism would really become an engagement with real Israeli life. That requires one big thing, however. Most Israelis speak pretty good English. Most Americans can't speak 3 words in Hebrew. Well, maybe Shabbat Shalom, but that's it. We got to learn some Hebrew so that we can participate in Israeli life in the language of the place. We can read the newspaper and engage in conversation, simple conversation about things that matter. And that, I think, is something that we need to work on now. That, I think, by the way, is doable. That's not so far high in the sky. All right, one last point, and then I want to ask you questions for our panel. On January 1st, 2000, the New York Times published 3 front pages. They published the front page of January 1st, 2000. They published the front page of January 1st, 1900. And they published an imaginary front page of the New York Times, January 1st, 2100. Right? Can you imagine this? So somebody noticed something, right? The page of 1900 was the real page. And it was amazing to contrast the stories that engaged readers of the New York Times 100 years before the millennium, and then on the millennium. But all the stuff on the year 2100 was remarkable. It turns out that January 1st, 2100 is a Friday. And there was a little box at the bottom of the page with the candle lighting time. And one commentator said, I cannot vouch for the veracity of anything on that page because it's completely imaginary, but I can tell you damn sure that on January 1st, 2100, some Jewish woman, some Jewish fellow is going to look at the bottom of that page to figure out when he or she should light candles to bring Shabbos in. That's the only thing on the page I can be 100% confident about. I love that. If you imagine what Jewish life was like January 1st, 1900, or if you want to go 100 years from now, January 1st, 1924, or November, December 4th, 1924, and what Jewish life is now. We worry about anti-Semitism. Do you know what December 4th, 1924 was like in Europe, in Russia? America had closed its borders. You could not immigrate here, right? At all, not even illegally. You couldn't immigrate. There's no way to get into the country. Jews were trapped in Eastern Europe with pogroms and anti-Semitism. Eretz Yisrael was still a dream. The land of Israel was a place you might get to maybe if you survived the malaria and you could fight for your way into that country. Europe was dangerous. Israel was dangerous. America had vicious anti-Semitism. The things that we worried about 100 years ago that we don't worry about now, and the way in which Jewish life has progressed. Everyone thinks that everyone in 1924 was Orthodox. Every American Jew, if you ask them, who are your ancestors? My great-grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi. Very Orthodox rabbi. And they came to America and they lived a very Orthodox. We are the barbarians. I got news for you. 1924, your ancestors were not Orthodox. There were no Hebrew schools. There were a few yeshivas and a few Talmud Torahs, but most Jewish kids did. More Jewish kids are going to Jewish schools now than went to Jewish schools in 1924. A greater percentage of the Jewish population of kids are going to Jewish schools now. There were no Jewish summer camps. There was no federation. There were Jewish welfare organizations, but no federation. There was no Hillel, because very few Jews could get on campus. Cal State Northridge did not exist. But even Harvard, you couldn't get on campus. I mean, there were a dozen Jews on camp at Harvard and Columbia. And most Ivy League schools wouldn't let Jews in. CCNY would let you in, but no place else. Think of how we've come in 100 years. And now let's think about where we're going for the next 100 years. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. And I know you have a few questions. Alana has the microphone. All right, so I'll have to use this. Please wait. She will give you the microphone. You get to talk. I want to remind everyone, once again, I'm sorry for being apodictic and imperative, but it's important, and imperious. But a question is a single-sentence interrogatory that begins with the question what, where, when, why, and how, and elicits an answer from one or many of our panelists, and is not your opinion. If you'd like to give a sermon, I would be delighted. Come Shabbos morning, walk up to the bima and tell Rabbi Leibowitz that you're here, and you can give the sermon. Okay, but otherwise, a question. Dr. Siegel, please.
This is not going to be a question, but as you've often said, this is a counter sermon.
Yeah,
okay.
but short, really short.
Short. It's going to be
I got lots
very
of
short.
people who want to make questions.
I want to endorse what you said about the Jewish day camps. I happen to be on the board of the Shalom Institute, and I can tell you firsthand that the kids that come to the Shalom Institute day camp are committed to their Judaism for the following reasons. They celebrate Judaism in a fun atmosphere, and they are embraced by the counselors and the whole ceremony and the whole situation. And my quotation is, Jewish day camps make Jews. These are the future leaders of our Jewish community, and it's been proven. We have numbers and we have statistics to prove that. So everybody over here, be cognizant of the Shalom Institute Jewish Day Camp in Malibu, It was burnt down, and we need support. Thank you.
So I meant to mention this earlier, but I am a true believer in Jewish summer camp as well, and a product of Jewish summer camp. And Jewish summer camp is during the summer. And one of my big concerns as a product of USY is the erosion of Jewish youth movements in this country. BBYO still doing very well. The other youth movements, not so much. And if I was waving my magic wand, my real dream is that the world for middle schoolers and teens and their year-round youth group experiences would be 100 times what it is now. And the cost wouldn't be a barrier, because those immersive experiences throughout the year are not just formative for people's Jewish identity, but towards their leadership skills and their abilities to be the next great board members and the next great professionals and the people who are going to drive our future forward. And I'm very concerned about that erosion. And I think that needs to be a bigger priority of our community.
This was excellent. Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say I totally agreed with what you said about the young adults. I have a 28-year-old, a 31-year-old, and a 33-year-old. They wouldn't, even though they were all raised here and they all went to school here and Milken and went to Camp Ramah, but they just don't come. They're not part of the organized Jewish community. They don't feel a connection. They don't feel a need. And so my question is this. If this panel was happening in Chicago, in New York, in Houston, in Atlanta, home of Emory, would it be the same? Would it be the same story? Or is this just unique to Los Angeles because we're such a spread out community? And I'm just wondering what's going on in other communities, and is there some differences, and are we learning from them?
I spent 18 years in Phoenix. There is no doubt that there are differences community to community, having to do with geography, having to do with history, having to do with identity, strength of federation, strength of synagogues, and so on and so forth. However, I'm certain that the fundamental challenges are exactly the same.
I'd like to know, what is Hillel 818?
We are a multi-campus Hillel. Cal State Northridge is our main campus, but we also serve LA Valley College and Pierce College. We also get students from Moorpark, College of the Canyons, Cal Lutheran. It's estimated that between all of those campuses, we have around 6,000 Jewish students at one of our campuses every year. And we do basically every sort of entry point that a Jew could want from their college experience, we offer, whether that be social programs, ritual and holiday programs, Jewish education, trips to Israel, community service, leadership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tonight at our Hillel building is our Hillel Formal, where we have 75 to 100 students dancing the night away. Every day there's something different. I might make a late night appearance depending on what my I don't want my dance moves to scare everyone off the dance floor. So
Actually, Bonnie asked my question, but I just want to make one comment, and it's small, and that is, Rabbi, when you spoke about awe, and you said not in a setting like this, well, a lot of us have experienced awe in a setting like this, and that was when Rabbi Schulweis spoke to us. We were all in awe, and then came Rabbi Feinstein, and we still are. So it's possible to
And
do it.
music and food, there are lots of ways to create awe,
Okay,
100%.
but we have experienced real awe in this place.
So I had a question about the issue of polarization, because I'm familiar with resetting the table, very familiar. In order to bring together people from different points of view, and different beliefs, political beliefs, to talk, there has to be a belief on both sides that it's going to make a difference. How would you do that?
Right, this is, I think fundamentally, we have to start young, right? We have to teach our kids how to have difficult conversations. And I don't think that technology is helping much, right? The quick notes and the texts and so forth, it's not allowing them to refine those skills that are super, super, super difficult. So I think starting earlier to have them really embrace and hear is critical, giving them those skills and starting in schools. But we do that right now. So we have a program. We started with 11 nonprofits that are working on systemic inequities facing Los Angeles, from Brotherhood Crusade, Sola I Can, Fulfillment Fund, Hope, Hopix, like all of these organizations that are dealing with really deep issues facing Los Angeles. And then they each suggested future leaders, these top leaders within their organizations. So they come from all walks of life. This year we had a Muslim, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, LGBTQ members. And then we begin the kind of the table setting, right? You know, resetting the table, but really kind of everyone is in it with an intended purpose to really lift up LA. And if you start with that good intention and you start with kind of a baseline of expectations of how we are going to hear and listen, and you begin to develop. We didn't start off with the controversial issues. We did not approach Israel until we got further down the program. I hosted a Shabbat, and we said, can I ask someone, an African-American woman said, can I ask you the unthinkable? And at that moment, it was a question about what she felt about an LGBTQ rally that had pro-Palestinian and why they would be targeting. And we just really, and we had a Muslim at the table. It's about beginning and starting from a good base of understanding, teaching people a skill that is not innate, to really listen and not think about, how many of you have already thought about your response as someone's speaking and how you're gonna like rebut their response. So we teach a practice of listening and identifying a kernel of what they see. And it's not all or nothing, right? We can hold two truths at the same time. And I think when people understand that your pain and my pain can both exist at the same time, and that we can work to figure out what is that Venn diagram of what we have in common and start there. So
I'll just add that two things. One is, to me, the threat of polarization is so grave that we have to be motivated to do this work. And in addition to convincing people that it can make a difference, I think to borrow an idea from your world, we need to convince them that it's safe to have those conversations.
I just wanted to say also on this topic that, I mean, so many of the programs Joanna mentioned are incredible, and Resetting the Table is an amazing organization and program. And I sometimes worry that we outsource the dialogue training to other organizations instead of modeling them in our own homes. I think the greatest thing that ever happened to me was the Shabbat dinner table growing up. Every Friday night, as we had Shabbat dinner as a family at my grandma and Zadie's, and we spent the entire dinner arguing about politics, pop culture, and these were, my grandfather was a judge, my dad was a lawyer, my uncle was a lawyer, my mom and my grandma were they should have been lawyers. These were intense conversations. My grandma used to say that, or my mom used to say that when I came home, my Zadie would get so excited because he knew that I wouldn't just give in to him, that I would argue back, right? And we had these loving but intense arguments where we had very different opinions, but it was modeled for me how to have those conversations and still love and respect the people I was disagreeing with. And I think that we don't model that in our own homes anymore at all. I mean, the joke about no politics at the Thanksgiving table, right? Like, you heard that in a million places. I wish that wasn't the case, and I think if we are serious about having difficult conversations with other people, but we can't do it with the people already in our lives, that's an unrealistic expectation. And if we can't talk to the people that we love, how are we supposed to talk to the people we don't yet even know?
Thank you. It's wonderful. I'm just going to ask a little more specific version of the question she just asked, because that need for dialogue that a couple of you have referred to, that problem of the hardened heart that you referred to, I mean, what can we do to bring a program here to VBS to teach us how to have those kinds of conversations with each other?
We actually did have, we had a short little opportunity with resetting the table to bring to the community, and then COVID hit. Let's try again.
Yes.
All right, Brian, you're on the committee. Yeah. What? Okay, I'm going to go over here one more and then over here.
Hi, I'm Debbie, and I have a question about the small number that you. I have a question about the small number of anti-Zionist Jews, because it was sort of mentioned but not focused on. And I can say from my own personal experience that my peer group, their children, many of them who have gone to Jewish day school, Jewish summer camp, come from conservative homes, had Shabbat dinner, are part of that group. And I think it's a real problem.
I think it's an example for the kind of dialogue that we're talking about. And I think after October 7th, I had tons of parents who really were struggling how to talk to their kids and how to listen to their kids. And I think it has to start with a self-check. Like, am I ready to hear what they have to say? If I'm sitting down to say, if you can just read this one article, I know you're going to change your mind, I wouldn't be optimistic that that's going to go well. But I think to really have a conversation, and there are some models you were asking about, resetting the table, and there's a model that we're using at Temple Israel, but of, very safe, warm-up questions, practicing listening to each other, practicing saying, I hear you, practicing saying, I understand where you're coming from. I think that is the way forward. At the same time, recognizing that it's painful for some of us, and this feeling, you didn't use these words, but where did we go wrong? We sent them to day school. We did all the things, and what this sort of being confounded by this reality. So I think one point is giving yourself space to have your side of the experience, and then also really being in a position to listen when we sit down with.
I actually just wanted, no, that's okay. There's another side of it, though, that I would say, so I'm not seeing it from I see it from a parent to daughter, but I will say from the outside community, the perniciousness of some of these anti-Zionist Jews who then become tokenized. Many of you may be aware of UTLA, right? And recently there was the vote that they passed that denied, it was hoping to promote Bernie Sanders' denial of weapons to Israel. UTLA, second largest teachers union in the nation. And they have literacy issues and all sorts of elements that we need to focus on in terms of helping our kids. And yet they took a vote to support Bernie Sanders. When you asked the teachers union, you dug down, and they said, well, it was the Jewish community who advocated for this. It was the Jewish representatives through our House of Representatives. And so we are getting that a lot, the perception and the conflation of the Jewish voice, when you looked at the Burbank resolution, the Santa Monica resolution, the Culver resolution that asked for a ceasefire or pro-BDS language, many of the people who spoke and testified were from the Jewish community. And so this is the challenge that we're facing, right? There's a conversation as a parent in a clergy, but in terms of the optics of how it's perceived outside and the mobilization of some of these voices who become the voice of the Jewish community to create political action, this is a real problem.
Yeah, I think it's I'm just going to add one comment. There are anti-Zionists and there are anti-Zionist Jews, but I think the phrase, the label anti-Zionist is used as a weapon, because there are people who are not anti-Zionists, but are against the current policies of the current Israeli government. But in the eyes of the organized Jewish in the eyes of some in the organized Jewish community, they are quickly labeled anti-Zionist because they are not mainstream. Okay? There are some who believe, for example, that Israel's ongoing occupation of territories on the West Bank, whether Yehuda and Samaria or whatever you want to call them, territories, is a moral problem and a strategic problem in the state of Israel, and they are labeled anti-Zionist. There are people who believe that Israel should have made a ceasefire a long time ago, and there were ceasefire offers that could have been made a long time ago with Hamas, and they are labeled anti-Zionist. So I think a distinction has to be made between people who object to current policies of a current government and people who really believe the state of Israel shouldn't exist. And the community has to be very careful. One of the strange things in Israel, there is a wider range of political opinions that are acceptable than there are here. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that Israelis serve in the military. So you have a writer like David Grossman, who's a very famous novelist, wins all kinds of awards with novels. He is crazy. Here, he would be labeled as an anti-Zionist. In Israel, he's just a leftist, and he's on television often. And part of the reason why he's legitimate in Israel is because he served in the IDF, and he actually lost a son on the Lebanese border. But he's considered an anti-Zionist if he steps into this in our community. So just be really careful about, I want to go back to what the rabbi said. We have to listen. We have to listen very carefully. If a kid tells you what Israel is doing bothers me, that's actually better than a kid who says, I couldn't care less what Israel does because Israel isn't part of me, right? But that's what I'm concerned about. There are anti-Zionists, I know, yes. There are those whose vision of policy would destroy Israel. I know that, but just have to really be careful, listen to the nuances of these things, because otherwise we label them all with a brush anti-Zionist. And what worries, I shouldn't talk so much, what worries me is that once you brand someone with anti-Zionist, they're not coming back in our community ever. And that concerns me. That concerns me a lot.
No. I also think that, like, you have to start by acknowledging how emotional and difficult this is for so many of us when having these conversations, right? I have a cousin who he and his father are within 5% of each other in terms of their views on Israel politics, the Israel administration, and yet when they talk about Israel to each other, they almost come to blows. I mean, they don't, but like the argument is so intense, and my cousin sometimes complains to me, you know, like it's like my dad's ashamed of me, even though like most people would think our views are the same, but like it hurts him to his core as a Jew that I think a little bit differently than him, and that's a minor example. So I know how hard it can be, but if you care about your families, your friends, your children's views on Israel and are worried that their views are detrimental to the future of Israel, the worst thing you can do is to treat their views as invalid. You can view them as wrong, but you can't just dismiss them. And so many of us do that so quickly with people we disagree with. We say, you're not just wrong, but your opinion doesn't matter and has no basis and just defies all logic, and you have to treat their thought processes as legitimate. They just drew a different conclusion. And when you approach the conversation like that, and you agree with what you can agree with, and treat their opinions as a legitimate stream of thought, then you have the opportunity to engage with them and hopefully have them listen to some of what you say. But you have to treat the conversation with respect. And it's so hard when you disagree with somebody so strongly to do that, but it's the only way you're going to make any progress.
Oh, you're going to make me stand up, huh? Okay, I really related strongly, Doctor, to the statistics about all the Jews who don't want to walk into a synagogue and their fear of it, and I just relate to that. I've been coming here a little over 30 years. There's probably people tell me 50 years, 60 years, whatever. What is being done about that? There is a sense for me of cultishness or acceptable responses. I particularly participate in learnings here, many with Rabbi Feinstein, which keep, because I know him for a long time now, I keep being able to push that sense of cult aside, or there's an appropriate response, and an inappropriate response, or a Hebrew school response, or whatever. And just so, question is, what's actively being done to open the doors to those people who feel very reluctant to deal with their own ignorance of this religion? I think that's true of any place of worship, Catholic Church, whatever.
Maybe our two rabbis have some thoughts on this question, but I think that the general discourse is about making synagogues understandable and introducing to new families and to folks who are sort of just testing the waters some exposure to liturgy and to the principles behind why we do certain things and what they represent. When people understand context, then it's always easier than to experience it and to feel less threatened or fearful of it. So I think that's certainly a first step, but the rabbis may have thoughts.
Well, I just want to say this won't solve it at all, but there's a tension between making ourselves entirely welcoming and accessible and maintaining the culture. So for example, if we really wanted to be accessible, per a couple points of, we would just do everything in English, right? Anybody could walk in the door if we just did everything in English, and people feel alienated when we use Hebrew. On the other hand, I feel very strongly that we lose something. There's a richness to the Hebrew. There's a depth to the fact that it's the language my grandparents prayed in, so on and so forth. So I think that I don't have an answer for you, but I think that we are always, those of us who are professionals, are always dancing in that tension. How do we make it welcoming and accessible, but still maintain where we want to go, where we want to take people?
So Joanna mentioned that the community organized a study, first time in 30-something years, a major study of the Jewish community and its identity. And a few years before that, there was a minor study of just the Valley. And David, of all the indicators of Jewish identity, you know what came out on top? Jewish food. Of all the places to go to identify as a Jew, synagogue, Federation School, Camp Hillel, Chabad, all those places, the number one was my local Jewish deli. So as a rabbi, I have to ask myself, what are they doing that I'm not doing? I mean, think about this for a second. And I'm not kidding about this. So I'll give you a silly example. I mean, so one of the conclusions is, I help teach a little bit at Milken. So Milken did a welcoming to new families, and they didn't just do a welcoming to new families, they did a challah bake, right? Because there's something so disarming about, like, let's bake a challah. Who could be against that? The other thing that a deli allows you to do is have a taste. You don't know if you like borscht? Let me bring you a cup, see if you like it, right? You never had a knish? I'll bring you half a knish, And I'm thinking, I'm trying to learn from this, right? How do you create a culture which is, as the rabbi said, which is authentic? Because we want authenticity. I mean, it's interesting that it wasn't Chinese restaurants. It was a Jewish deli. No, I'm serious. We want it to be authentic, but we want it to be accessible. And how do you bring authentic and accessible together? And one of the ways is, give me a taste. Let me taste it. One of the most wonderful experiences here at VBS is something called Tat Shabbat. We do it twice a month. You get about 400 people on a Saturday morning. Half of them are under the age of 4, and the other half have not been in synagogue since either they were in Hillel or they were in high school. And they come and they get a taste. A little music, a little prayer, a little Torah, little coffee, by the way, and donuts. And they walk away with a feeling of, I can belong here. I do belong here. This is my place. It's a wonderful question.
So I think that one of the things you're seeing in synagogues around the country is that synagogues are becoming de facto community centers as much as they can. And they're offering so many different entry points to serve all these different communities and types of people who want to join. Now, on the one hand, that's amazing and beautiful. The challenge is it takes more staff and more money to do those things and more space to do those things. But as Rabbi Feinstein just talked about Tat Shabbat, so me and my wife, the time outside of, she's here every day teaching, but the most I'm here at VBS is I'm here for every Tat Shabbat with my 3.5-year-old, right? And I have a group of friends who would never come, like, joining a synagogue is not something that they are actively thinking about, or some are not in the financial position to do, but I can get them all to come to Tat Shabbat because it's something to do with their kids on a Saturday morning that's free and fun, and all the kids are around dancing and singing the whole time, and that's an easy sell. Or I have another group of friends who I would never get to come to Shabbat morning services, but came with me to the men's club steak event a year and a half ago, and it was like a cook your own steak men's club event here at VBS. And I think that the diversity of programs for different types of communities is the way that a lot of synagogues are addressing that, with the caveat that it's really challenging to do that in a financially sustainable way.
I know the families of all these wonderful people, and I promise to have them home before dawn. So we're going to take one more question.
Okay.
Michael asked a question.
Yeah.
And then would you come up, rush up, and if
I will.
they have to go home, and afterwards.
Okay. I'm sorry I didn't run into you, Matt, at our steak. You may have been there, I may have been there, but it is a lot of fun. So my question is about money. And I mean, I think, the points made here about $50,000 a year to live a Jewish life. I mean, that probably doesn't even include sending a Jewish kid to a Jewish school. That's another $50,000 or whatever, or several kids. So, I mean, I think in the short term, maybe we'll be okay, because, I mean, my wife and I have stopped giving to our alma maters because they're such anti-Semitic hellholes, so that money is being rechanneled into the Jewish community. But I think that's a very important point. Yes, it would be great to be able to fund people's Jewish life. I know lots of people who say, I said, well, a member of the synagogue. No, I go to Chabad. I know lots of people who say that because, I mean, essentially it's free, but it's about the religion that they know. And so my question is, where is that next generation of Jewish donors going to come from? People who are willing to support institutions like this, or Hillel, or Federation, or Temple Israel of Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood itself is very unfamous for supporting Jewish institutions. There's museums and libraries and other things. So where are the people going to come from who are going to support Jewish life?
Yes, here we go. So I'm not on the campaign side of the house of Federation, so I'll do my best here. I think we have to be smart in how we lobby and legislate for some of this, and how we look for funding. So this year, Federation took a big bet, for example, and we co-partnered with Teach California. Teach California basically looked for how to get access to those who have developmental disabilities, who have shadows, that are paid for in the public school, but not in the private school. And 3 weeks ago, we were successful through this lawsuit of winning in a Supreme Court verdict that money can now go, instead of just for public schools, it can help and be used in private schools. Now, this applies for Jewish day schools. So this is just one little area, whereas a person who had a child that that had disabilities, they were forced to go to the public school to access these resources, and as a result of this. Whether or not it's us lobbying, we got $80 million working with Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel to help support security, a huge cost of Milken and D. Toledo and VBS and Temple Israel of Hollywood, to help individual institutions use that federal and state funding and offset it instead and use tap into that money and use money in other ways. So we're trying to be creative about it, trying to use our system. Right now there are 20 legislative bills around the country that access federal dollars for Catholic and Jewish and religious schools. We're looking into legislation. So there are ways in which we just have to be a little bit more creative. In terms of developing the next generation of philanthropists, we're working on that, right? So how do you exercise that giving muscle where there's a whole group of people who know, right? Like you just knew, you put money in the pushka, you just donated. How do we train the next generation to do that? So part of it is tapping into, our Hillcrest community, our LCAB community, our Brentwood community, in which we have next generation leaders. We've started a family entity of kind of the top donors in Los Angeles and their kids. So we're slowly building that machine, but we have to do more for sure.
I'll just say one thing slightly in jest, which is, since my kids were very little, I taught them, when somebody asks, what do you want to be when you grow up, the answer is a philanthropist. And I do believe that youth philanthropy will be a key to our future.
That's amazing. I live this challenge every day at Hillel 818. We get great support from the Jewish Federation and from Hillel International, but 70% of our budget I have to personally fundraise from people like those of you in this room. And the average age of our donors is easily over 60. The amount of money that comes from donors under the age of 60 is probably less than 5% of our annual giving. The Federation has amazing programs. CLI is one of the amazing programs. New Roots is an amazing program that they do that cultivates a new generation. And this is another area where, while we have incredible programs, to me, so much of it starts with conversations in our homes with our family. That having almost any of the topics we talked about tonight, the best way, in my opinion, to move those conversations forward and ensure that we have a great Jewish future is by having these hard conversations with our families in our homes and having real, authentic discussions about why these things are important to you and what's important to them and how you hope that they will continue whatever legacy that you have created and built. And some of my donors are so incredible at having those conversations and bringing their children into the philanthropic process. But so many people are not, and they just hope that their children will pick up where they left off. But hope isn't enough. Like, Judaism's, yes, our anthem is Hatikva, but Judaism is a religion of doing, right? We have 613 commandments of action, not of belief. And we have to have these conversations in order to move things forward. And I think that like these Federation programs and other organizations' programs are incredible, but it all starts in the home.
It's actually a wonderful question, and it's worth a long conversation. But briefly, most of you know that every year on holidays, I give a little appeal for the shul, not a little, a big appeal for the shul. It's part of my job as the rabbi of the synagogue, and every year, without fail, I get accosted sometime the week after by some person, usually a young person, and ironically, it's usually at Starbucks, and that person is holding a coffee that costs north of $7 and tells me that I ruined the spirituality of the holiday by asking for money. And I'm used to this now because the psychology is so interesting, right? Because this is a person who has grown up and comes to understand that the institutions of the community are like the trees in the neighborhood. They're ageless, that no one knows who planted them, no one trims them or waters them, they just grow from the ground. And when you disabuse them of this and you say, I'm sorry, but an institution is a product of the will of a community. And that product of the will of the community is sustained by people's contributions. And without those contributions, the institution dies. They completely don't understand this. They understand two sectors. They understand the economy, where it's transactional, and they understand the state, which is power. But they don't understand the notion of society. And society is an act of will. It's our collective consciousness, our collective creation. All right, we had a great thing happen in this synagogue, in this community some years ago. There was a beautiful bookstore, a Barnes & Noble bookstore on the corner that was beautiful. And by the way, it was making money. And it closed because, it wasn't because the store was not profitable. The store was profitable. But the landlord got a better bid from a drugstore, from CVS, than from Barnes & Noble. And somebody from here had the chutzpah to go to the fellow who owned the shopping center. He happened to run for mayor some years later. And say to him, you believe in community, that's community for us. We don't need another drugstore. And the guy said, yeah, but I'm in the business of making money, and they offered me more money, right? By the way, that made my job so easy that year, because I said, as goes CVS, so does VBS. And people whipped out their checkbooks. It was unbelievable. But, I think that there's a whole change in consciousness of how you... Look, and the problem was exactly what you said. My bubby had 50 pushkas, 50 charity boxes lined up on her sink. I remember I looked at him once, I said, Bubby, this charity hasn't existed for 100 years. Like, well, no, she said, no, I send them money every year. Like, so there's some chassid somewhere in Jerusalem who say, oh, that's Mrs. Feinstein's money. I saw her give money. When I was a kid, we put dimes in a card and planted trees in Israel. Today, you don't do that. You go online and you click a button and it takes your credit card number and the child never sees the family give charity. So I yell at these parents and little kids and I say, give tzedakah together. Do it. If you're going to push the button, let the kid push the button. Show them that giving is part of Jewish life and that it is our way of sustaining a community. You've got to train people from the bottom up. You've got to train them from the very beginning that giving is part of this culture. I'm sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
going to make a shameless plug in that case. There's a toy drive coming up for Hanukkah, and it's giving to people in Los Angeles to help the most needy of children across all the different organizations, non-Jewish organizations that we're working on. And in my family, a practice is on the 8th night, after all the gluttony of gifts and so forth, the 8th night is give back. And so I'd encourage each of you to go onto the Federation website. It's a toy drive that just have the kids pick out which toys they want to give and click on it, and it will send it to them and have them be involved in that, because that is an act of taking action, giving, and it's our modern day pushka.
I want to thank the members of our panel tonight for joining us. Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to Professor Windmuller for sharing this. And to all of you, be careful, it's freezing cold. It's 67 degrees outside. So bundle up, and get outside and take care and have a happy Hanukkah. Stay well, everyone.